On a cold winter morning in December 1995, the bodies of three men were discovered inside a parked Range Rover situated down a small farm track in the village of Rettendon in Essex, England. The victims, who had all been shot dead, were soon identified as three violent drug dealers and members of a notorious gang known as the Essex Boys. The subsequent police investigation, codenamed Operation Century, would prove to be highly controversial for the tactics employed by the Essex Police Special Branch officers working undercover, and because it resulted in no arrests or criminal evidence that led to a conviction. During a subsequent police investigation, two suspects were identified and charged with the triple killings. These men would go on trial at the Old Bailey in 1998, where they were implicated by an accomplice and received terms of life imprisonment. When details of the heavy-handed methods of Operation Century became public knowledge, Essex police were forced to defend the unconventional covert operation in the face of mounting criticism. What is the story behind the Rettendon murders? In the small village of Rettendon, Essex, 47-year-old Ken Jiggins knocked on the door of his friend, farmer Peter Theobald, to help him feed the 800 pheasants kept in fields at the 130-acre farm. Theobald ran a shooting range, and the birds needed to be fed twice a day. That morning his friend offered to help because of the severe frost that day meant he couldn't work his regular job as a bricklayer. The snow had begun to settle at 4 p.m. the previous day on December 6, continuing into the early hours when the frost had set in. Theobald had to scrap thick ice from the windows of his Land Rover, and as they drove across the field, situated 300 yards away, they noticed another vehicle. It was a metallic blue Range Rover, parked in front of a locked gate leading to an angler's carp pond near the shooting area. Despite the ice, the windows on the Range Rover were clear, and they could see two men sat in the front seats. Mr. Jiggins would later say he thought they were asleep, and suspected they might be poachers. As he jumped out to ask them to move, he tapped on the window then shouted, "There are two dead men here." Whilst he used his mobile phone to alert police, Theobald moved closer to check and saw another dead man slumped across the back seat. As he looked more closely at the driver, he noticed both his hands were still on the steering wheel and later he learned, his foot was still pressed on the brake. Familiar with firearms, Theobald noticed a 2-inch round entry wound behind his ear that exited out through his mouth. There was some blood seeping out of the car, but not as much as he expected. At 8:30 a.m. that morning, Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley was breakfasting at home in Chelmsford when he received the call that a triple murder had been committed. Despite the 50-year-old detective enjoying his day off, he quickly assumed the lead in the investigation. Dibley had headed more than 25 murder investigations in the previous 5 years, 2 of which had remained unsolved. Throughout 1995, he had cleared up 10 murders in the previous months, but the Rettendon investigation would be his first triple murder inquiry, but also his biggest and last case as he was due to retire at the end of April after serving for 32 years in the force. Working out of South Woodham Ferrers Police Station, D.S. Dibley's 40-strong squad descended on Rettendon on that cold winter morning at Workhouse Lane, a regular spot for courting couples. Arriving on the scene they found the bodies of 3 men, each of whom had been shot twice in the head at close range with what appeared to be a 3-round pump-action 12-bore shotgun. The man sitting in the passenger seat had suffered a particularly gruesome blast to the head, which had partly obliterated his face, leaving him unrecognizable, while the man seated in the back of the vehicle had been shot twice in head and once in the stomach. It had all the hallmarks of a cold-blooded execution, and detectives attempted to piece together the sequence of events, and determine whether the killer or killers had been seated in the Range Rover with the victims, or had ambushed the men from outside the vehicle, blasting them to death before they realized what was happening. Det Superintendent Dibley said, "This is not an ordinary murder. It looks as if they were enticed down there. As far as murders go, you don't get any more serious than this." The first part of the investigation involved identifying the deceased, through a process of fingerprint analysis. If the men had a prior history of criminality, they could be identified. Luckily for police, all 3 men were known to law enforcement, who were the victims of the Rettendon Range Rover murders. The dead men were soon revealed to be well known to police, and identified as local hardmen and small-time gangsters. The driver was 26-year-old Craig Rolfe, whilst the man in the passenger seat was his boss, 38-year-old Tony Tucker. The back seat passenger was Tucker's boyhood friend, 37-year-old Pat Tate. All three were known drug dealers with criminal records, who used their physical strength to intimidate and cause fear to their enemies. And these men had many enemies in their line of work. For all intents and purposes it appeared to be a gangland reprisal. D.S. Dibley learned the men been planning to go for a meal with girlfriends that evening, at a Basildon restaurant at 8 p.m., and both Tucker and Tate were still holding their mobile phones when they were shot dead. None of the victims were wearing seatbelts and there was no sign of a struggle, and they presumably realized their fate. Some believed it might have been a professional hit, because 2 of the victims died within 2 seconds, while the third, the back seat passenger Pat Tate, had possibly saw what happened to his 2 companions and attempted to escape but was killed soon afterwards. It was strongly suspected they were summoned to a meeting by someone they trusted. But what wasn't clear was why Workhouse Lane was chosen as the meeting place. Although the area was quiet, it was not deserted, with the farmhouse less than 300 yards away. A nearby pond was often used by drug smugglers to place hidden stashes under the water, so the area may have been familiar to the victims. None of the men were armed when their bodies were discovered, and Pat Tate traveled almost everywhere with a gun. The killer fired off 8 rounds, leaving the spent cartridges where they fell, possibly because it was too dark to retrieve them. 3 shots were fired off in quick succession, killing Rolfe, then Tucker. It was surmised that before he could react, Tate was shot in the abdomen. The gunman then reloaded the shotgun, before shooting him twice in the head, and for good measure then fired another shot each into the already dead Tucker and Rolfe. Dibley believed Tate was the target, the others were merely collateral damage. See you all for the next cases. Please like and subscribe to my channel to support me.